Okay, thanks for joining me, everybody. Chuck Morse, Left Right Radio. My guest is Alex Newman. He is a investigative journalist. He's with the New American Magazine. He's the author of Crimes of the Educators, co-authored with my good friend, the late, great Dr. Samuel L. Blumenfeld. Alex, you are reporting from Europe. We're doing a series of live broadcasts from Europe to get your observations on the ground, so to speak. So how you doing, Alex? What's happening?
Well, I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me, Chuck. I appreciate it. And can't complain. It's beautiful weather here. A lot going on. President Trump was just in Helsinki, which is just a short boat ride away, and a lot of buzz around here. So,
well, that's what I want to get to, because President Trump made a lot of news, obviously, in Europe, both in Britain, which I'd like to talk about, but also in the very famous, now famous, meeting in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin, which he has now set off a firestorm unlike anything that I've seen yet. I mean, I'm sure that the establishment left would have attacked Trump no matter what he did in Europe. He could have kicked Putin in the shins and they would have attacked him for trying to cause a nuclear war. It doesn't matter. He could have signed a good agreement ending nuclear proliferation and they would have attacked him. But the fact is that I think President Trump seemed to have handed a weapon to his enemies in this case. What are your observations on the ground over there with regard to what happened in Helsinki?
Well, I think one good barometer, if you want to measure, the success or how bad something was, is the reaction of the establishment media. So the fact that the establishment media is freaking out and running around like they have their hair on fire, to me is an indication that Trump did something right. People who read my work regularly know that I'm not a fan of Putin. In fact, I wouldn't trust the guy as far as I could throw him. And I think Trump understands that as well. In fact, the left, the hard left, understands very well that Trump views Putin and Russia as a strategic enemy. In fact, the head of the Communist Party USA, a guy named John Bachtel, who likes to collude with the mass murdering dictatorship in China, he was just over there for some Karl Marx 200th anniversary festivities. He pointed out that Trump correctly, in my view, views Russia and China as a strategic threat. But you're right. No matter what Trump did with Putin, he would have been criticized by the usual suspects. You're exactly right. If he had gone there and kicked him, it would have been, oh my goodness, how could he do that? What kind of diplomacy is that? And if he had done what he did, then they would freak out too. I give a lot of deference to the Paul family, Ron Paul and Rand Paul. And I saw Rand Paul's comments on this, and I'm inclined to agree with him. Whether we like Putin or not, and I don't think we should, I think he's, very much along the lines of a gangster. He is very globalist in his outlook. He's building a Eurasian Union, just like the Europeans are doing their European Union and the South Americans are doing their Union of South American States. I mean, this is all part of the puzzle. So I don't trust Putin. But Rand Paul is right. We want to have open lines of communication with foreign governments, especially at a time of increased tensions when there's a risk of misunderstandings. There's NATO exercises going on here in the Baltic, for crying out loud. And if a plane got shot down, a missile got launched, some itchy trigger finger pulled the trigger and somebody got shot, it could very quickly escalate. So we want to have open lines of communication. I don't think Trump gave anything to Putin. I think the indictment, so-called, announced right ahead of the summit. I mean, to me, that was just a transparent ploy by the deep state to try to sabotage Trump's meeting. And I think Trump handled it very well, actually.
The whole interaction and the relations with Putin, I mean, obviously we want to have diplomatic relations and the line open, but it makes me nervous as somewhat of a student of history, looking back to FDR's relation with Stalin and, this whole idea of convergence, which was a catchphrase in the 1930s of bringing the United States and Russia, moving Russia to the right, moving the United States to the left until they converge in the middle. I'm uncomfortable with it. I think most conservatives are. But the main trigger point for the American establishment was that President Trump has publicly denied this narrative about a Russia collusion inside the United States with his campaign and Russian interference in the American election, which, I mean, I think that they certainly, there's a great deal of evidence that they did interfere. I mean, they've interfered in elections going all the way back to Hoover. And that even Obama launched an investigation of Russian hacking and Russian sabotage of cyberspace going back to the election of 2008. So putting it into a context, I think what is upsetting to Trump is the fact that this investigation is obviously very one-sided, which makes it look like, as he says, a witch hunt. They're not looking at collusion between Russia and the Clinton campaign, which there's actually a great deal more evidence to show that. Not to mention Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein. It's all focused on Trump, which is what is, I think, getting to him, and that may not be a good thing. He should ride above it. But the fact is that the so-called deep state, which I think he accurately identifies, elements of the Justice Department, of the intelligence community, of the FBI, have literally been agitating to overthrow the government. And this came out recently in testimony in Congress with crooked FBI agent Peter Strzok and others. And that's what I think Trump is reacting to, more than whether or not, in the broad sense, Russia interfered in the election, which I think is kind of a given.
Yeah, it's so much important stuff right there, Chuck. And I think you hit the nail on the head on just about everything. You know, the notion that's been peddled for a long time, even of the whole collapse of the Soviet Union, I think we need to go back and re-examine that. You know, Putin comes out of KGB world. We've had very high-level defectors, including Anatoly Golitsyn. I recommend everybody read his two books, New Lies for the Old and the Perestroika Deception. What he argued, and this was before the fall of the Iron Curtain, this was while the Soviet Union was still alive and well, he made about 200 predictions, and as far as I know, about 196 or 97, it may be more now, have come true. And what he said was that there was a long-range disinformation operation, and he was working in Department D of the KGB, which was the disinformation department, had a plan to create a phony collapse of communism, a phony collapse of the Soviet Union, a phony liberalization of Eastern Europe. And I mean, he proved to be exactly correct. He even named some of the players, right? I mean, now we know from old intelligence files that these guys were on the Soviet payroll, all the while posing as anti-communist freedom fighters and whatnot. And so you're right, there is this agenda for convergence, and there's been subversive elements in high-ranking positions in the United States, and of course many people in Moscow who've been totally on board with this agenda. And it encompasses education, it encompasses, you know, the whole global warming environmental movement. So this is absolutely huge, and I completely share your concerns. As for you know, the deep state, again, I agree with you 100%. And you know, Peter Strzok's testimony was just an absolute, as Trump puts it, an embarrassment, a disgrace to our country. It really was a complete disgrace to the FBI and to all the good men and women who work in the government and who are not interested in overthrowing the government and lying and cheating and stealing and committing crimes. So you know, there is all that whole component to it. And you know, Trump also did some other things while he was in Europe that I think are, you know, very, very important. For example, I just wrote about in the New American how he exposed the Brexit fraud being perpetrated by Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He also called out NATO. He called out Germany for being in Russia's pocket. Right, on the one hand, they're sending Germany is sending Russia billions of dollars. And giving them basically a stranglehold over their economy by allowing them to become dependent on Russian oil and on Russian energy. And on the other hand, they're expecting U.S. taxpayers and our military to protect them from Russia. So, you know, Trump hit a home run there by calling that out. I think it was the right thing to do. And, you know, all the liberals and the establishment media people lost their heads over it. Well, good. You know, again, that's a sign that Trump did the right thing. In fact, I would have gone further. I would have pointed out that Merkel has a background as a propagandist for the East German Communist Party. You know, I would have taken it the next step further, but there's only so much you can say and still remain within the bounds of acceptable diplomacy. So overall, I think Trump's success here in Europe was a huge success. I think there's going to be fallout from this for a long time. He called out the immigration thing too. You know, what we talked about last time I was on your program, Chuck. He said, I think on 3 or 4 different occasions, hey, this is going to be very bad for Europe. You guys are losing your culture. Millions and millions of people are coming here, and it's going to prove to be disastrous for you. And he was exactly right. So I think he accomplished a lot of good. And the fact that the media is acting like it was some horror show tells me that he did a great job.
Well, he didn't behave like past presidents going all the way back to Eisenhower, where they go to Europe, and they have a lot of nice pictures taken, and they have a lot of fancy dinners, and they play golf, and they do the negotiation behind closed doors, and everything is said in very careful, diplomatese, every public statement. Instead, he actually went there and he defended American interests. He said, look, I want to have a better deal for the United States. I want you to pay for defense if we're going to continue to even be here. You're becoming too dependent on the Russians. Britain, you should go honestly continue with the Brexit as you were elected to do, even though they have not. And he did mention the problem of millions of migrants flooding into Europe, what that could do to Europe. So, he did speak plainly. He did defend American interests. And, of course, the establishment liberal media is going absolutely berserk over that. And they have the gall. The thing that I find particularly appalling, and this is true with the Helsinki thing too, is that they have the gall, people like Charles Schumer, and to say he is criticizing America on foreign soil. I mean, you take a look at Clinton's apology tour, going back, to presidents probably as far back as Wilson, traveling around the world and criticizing the United States. He's not criticizing the United States. He's criticizing an element in the United States that exists in those countries as well. I hope that people in Europe on the street where you are right now, Alex, are understanding this. What is the general understanding on the street about this trip? Have people learned anything in Europe about from this?
Well, it's been very interesting because the establishment media here in Europe is just as bad as the establishment media in the United States. And so they're kind of struggling, running around like chickens with their heads cut off. They can't decide whether to completely ignore all the truth bombshells that Trump dropped or whether to freak out like the American fake news, the CNN and so on, and pretend like the world is crashing down and all the rest of it. So it's a very interesting scenario. I think there's a growing number of Europeans who recognize that despite all the media hatred, and I'll tell you, in some of the European countries, people still have more trust in their media than they do in the United States. And the media has literally, in some cases, tried to paint Trump as a new Hitler. And so there are a lot of people who are under this misguided impression that Trump is some sort of authoritarian, that,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, quite the opposite. That's been a open theme. I mean, even this recent meeting in Helsinki, MSNBC is talking about Kristallnacht. and Pearl Harbor. I mean, it's just that in a sense, as usual, they've overstepped themselves and they're disgracing themselves, which I think ultimately is going to hurt them and boomerang onto them. I take a slight issue with you and with Golitsyn's analysis in that I do think that the Soviet Union, it did collapse. It was not intended. They lost those satellite states, which are now sovereign and which are becoming more oriented toward Western capitalism and free market, places like the Baltic republics and even Central Asia and the Caucasus region. And I don't think that was their intention. I think it collapsed because of the leadership of Reagan and people like Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul II. And while certainly Putin is a man of the left and he's an authoritarian and he's a former KGB agent, I don't think he's of the same pedigree as Gorbachev or Stalin or any of the hardline Soviet communists. He seems to be, at least publicly, a Christian. He seems to have at least, I think that Russia's moving in the right direction. It's a country that's never had a history of a middle class and of freedom. They were beginning to develop that under Nicholas II when the Soviets subverted it. But nevertheless, in my way of thinking, I think we should be encouraging Russia. We should be aligning ourselves with Russia in the war against radical Islam, particularly the outright war in the Middle East. And we have other common interests with Russia. It's an interesting perspective, and
I was in Russia not too long ago, and my perception of it was that it is a very strange society. Whether they can ever recover from the horrors of almost 100 years of communism hard to know. But what I've noticed in my research, and I keep finding this across Eastern Europe, and certainly it's not true in every case. I think Poland is a good example where the moles got exposed. Even Lech Walesa, the supposed anti-communist hero, now we find out he was on the Soviet payroll. His code name was Bolek, and he had been working for the Soviets all along. So, I think a lot of these people are being exposed. But if you look at a country like Bulgaria, for example, the communists from before the collapse of the Iron Curtain are still running the show. So, after the Nazi Germany empire collapsed, we put them all on trial. We tried them for war crimes, and we hung a lot of them. Whereas when the Soviet Union collapsed, not only did these people not get executed or even put on trial for their horrific crimes, for mass murder, for torture, for absolute atrocities, they were given a new lease on life as either oligarchs or government ministers or heads of new democratic political parties. So there is an interesting situation there. But to go back to something you mentioned earlier, John Brennan, I don't think we can get through this conversation. He was calling Trump, he said that this trip was treasonous. Yeah. And the irony of that, this is a guy who admitted before he realized Trump was going to be president that he had voted for Gus Hall in 1976. Gus Hall was, of course, the puppet of the Soviet Union. He was the Communist Party USA candidate for president, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And he also admitted that he told his CIA interviewers this when he was trying to get his security clearance. So for somebody who openly supported communist dictatorship in the United States to come out and say Trump was committing treason by talking to Vladimir Putin and saying, hey, let's cooperate in Syria so we can get the civil war over. Let's talk about this issue of meddling and all the rest of it. It boggles the mind. And so these are all huge questions.
That somebody like that could be the head of the CIA.
It speaks volumes, I think. And, there's so much evidence showing that the communists were, if not in total control, in control of large parts of our intelligence agencies throughout that time. My friend Frank de Varona and I, we just put out an article on how the globalists in the Council on Foreign Relations and, people like the Dulles brothers and people high in the intelligence agencies helped put Fidel Castro in power. They helped, the OSS played a huge role in selling out Eastern Europe to communism. So, there's been this open question. And, it's ironic. Dick Novak, a columnist, wrote that the OSS had been, infiltrated by the communists. And the head of the OSS Society, kind of the OSS veterans, wrote a letter to the editor of the Washington Post. Said, we weren't infiltrated by the communists. We hired the communists. And so, all the while, the justification for so many of these government programs, the hijacking of so many areas that don't belong to the federal government, the propaganda, the brainwashing, the manipulation, the security agencies, the quadrillions of dollars, gazillions of dollars squandered on so-called defense was all justified under the guise of the threat of communism. And of course, communism was a big threat. But at the same time, you had these guys up and down every agency of government with nobody willing to do anything about it. So, there's all these big questions. And actually, that's something I go into in some depth in the special issue we did on the deep state recently. Communism was the justification for creating a big part of this deep state. And all the while, this deep state was working hand in glove with the communists. It's horrible to have to say it, but that's the truth.
And now the deep state is involved in and has been involved in attempting to overthrow the legitimate elected government of the United States. I think that they want to continue the dialectic with the old Soviet Union, but with today's Russia, of a conflict that helps them continue to build up the military-industrial complex. And certainly if Clinton had been elected, that would have been the case. There was a lot of saber rattling on that side of the fence, not to mention compromise. Whereas with Trump, he wants to have a normal relationship with Russia. He doesn't want to continue a conflict. He's not an interventionist. He wants to have a strong military on both coasts, but he doesn't want to necessarily intervene. I mean, there's even a report out today that he wants to negotiate with the Taliban to end the war in Afghanistan after 20 years. I mean, he wants to basically normalize America's relations with the rest of the world and not engage in what historian Charles Beard called perpetual war for perpetual peace. And to my way of thinking, that's what the crux of this rage is all about. He's more of a normal president. Trump, I heard this on, I think it was one of these real left-wing, I think it was Tom Hartman. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Way out on the left, he broadcasts on Russian television, RT. He made the accusation that Trump's father had been in the John Birch Society. Now, when I was thinking about it, I was like, wow, okay. So Trump gets it. You know, I think his father probably was one of the members that was the quiet type of member, you know, not the public. But that tells me that Trump understands. I mean, he has a background in what he's dealing with here. You know, this sort of international globalist, informal world order element that is every bit a part of the American establishment. It's part of the top 1% wealthiest, who all tend to be on the left or support the left. You know, the people that are entrenched into the Department of Justice and the intelligence community and the FBI. Trump understands what he's dealing with here, which is why, I mean, what an extraordinary thing. I mean, what an amazing person to have in that position. I am concerned about not only him personally and his safety, frankly, but the need to make sure that the people of the United States and people in Europe understand what they're up against here, understand the nature of the enemy that is trying to literally overthrow Trump. And I do mean literally. I think they would like to take him out in any way they can. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, you know, so much there to comment on. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, one of the talking heads on CNN just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, said that why doesn't the deep state come out and overthrow the government, right? I mean, just openly on national television. Right. I don't know how many people
calling for coup d'etat. Right.
That's right. I mean, that is essentially advocacy of overthrowing the government. I mean, that is incredibly serious. And I think there's a lot of people who believe that. As for Trump's father being a member of the John Birch Society, that's a very interesting comment you made. I had not heard that from that person, but I was meeting with Roger Stone. I've had a couple meetings with Roger Stone, who's been a good friend of Donald Trump, an advisor to him since the 1980s. And he told me the same thing. He said Trump's dad was very close to JBS, was a good friend of JBS founder Robert Welch, was a financier of the organization. And, you know, he was a builder. He couldn't afford to take political stands one way or the other. He wouldn't get his permits approved. You know, that's kind of the nature of the business that he was in. But, you know, Trump comes from a family that really understands this. And he's got people around him who really, really understand it. He's got people high up in his administration in some of the most powerful posts who have a very clear understanding of what's happening in this world. And, you know, to comment on what you said on Russia, again, I think another home run, Chuck. There was a report that was put out back in 1968 by the State Department and the Institute for Defense Analyses by a guy called Lincoln Bloomfield. And it was called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. And, you know, they go through all these scenarios. So how are we going to get to a world effectively controlled by the United Nations? And their conclusion was, if we want to get there, the quickest way is to use war or the threat of war. So if Trump suddenly goes out and, you know, suddenly we're at peace with everybody, we're not under threat of war, we're not engaged in war in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Syria, you know, there's peace, we're dealing normally with other governments, then suddenly you lose the justification for so much of this architecture that's been built up. What do we need a NATO for? What do we need a UN for? What do we need, you know, $1 trillion so-called security apparatus for? You know, it just all vanishes. And so they need somebody like Putin to be a boogeyman. And again, I'm not friendly towards Putin. I think he's very suspicious. But the establishment needs somebody like him. And if he didn't exist, they would create somebody like him to justify the massive spending on the armaments, the massive international bureaucracies that have grown up around this cause of making peace, which, of course, they never do. So, you know, I think this hits on so many important things. And I think that really explains why we're seeing so much of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, he's ratcheting back the war stance that the United States has been in since World War II. He's normalizing relations with the North Korean dictatorship by doing something that I thought was absolutely brilliant, offering to build hotels and resorts. I mean, that, you know, what could be better than that? I mean, you know, he's, you know, I think he's taken steps toward bringing about more of a rapprochement among the Israelis and the Palestinians as well. You know, these defeating ISIS in conjunction with Russia. I mean, we have a common interest in that, in stopping the spread of radical Islam. And with regard to Europe standing up for nationality and for nation states over the European Union, which he openly had the nerve to criticize and support Brexit. So, this does go to exactly what you're saying here, Alex. It's a removal of this world stance that the entire planet is divided into two camps that are on the verge of a war to scare the you-know-what out of everybody. Now, one of the things that was mentioned by Putin directly, which I thought was fascinating during their press conference, was he talked about this shadowy figure, Thomas Browder, who he said had donated up, I think it was $500 million to the either the Democratic National Committee or to Hillary Clinton. Now, I don't think the media is going to follow up on it. The New York Times mentioned it in one sentence without any context, just simply, he said this, and then they moved on. But I sense that this is a bombshell. Now, this, is a response to the charge that somehow Trump was in collusion with Russia. It gets to a little bit of a lifting up of the hood on this whole corrupt, rotten, liberal Democrat Eastern Seaboard collusion in the real sense. What do you think? Have you heard anything about that?
I saw the same thing as you, just brief mentions of it here and there, and unfortunately I haven't had the time to dig deeper. But one of the things that I heard was that one of the reasons the establishment may be freaking out so much is that they may be concerned that Putin has given Trump information that they want to conceal at all costs. And if that were the case, it wouldn't surprise me. And so, I think there's going to be a lot to follow up on after this meeting for legitimate journalists. Of course, the Communist News Network, nobody expects any real news from them, but legitimate journalists have a lot of work to do now in tracking down leads and figuring out what's really happened. So.
But the legitimate journalists don't hold the high ground in the media.
That's true. And that's why people don't believe the media anymore. That's why people are tuning out the fake news and tuning into the alternative media. I mean, that's why the alternative media has essentially become the dominant force now. The entire unified establishment media could not throw the last election. You had, I think, 998 out of 1,000 of the top newspapers against Trump in the last election, and they got it handed to them. So, they've lost their power, and I've written on this. The establishment, I think, is in a panic mode now because their propaganda organs are no longer effective. So now they're trying to use Google to censor things. They're trying to just, ban everything on Facebook. And it's because they're in a panic. I mean, at some point soon, they may have to revert to reverse psychology. And, if they want a policy passed, they'll have to have the CNN people tell us why it's such a bad policy. So, that's, I think, how desperate they're getting. The polls show, I think, 6% of Americans still say they have a great deal of trust in the media. Less than 15% of Americans say, or Republicans say they have any trust in the media. And, I've yet to meet these people. I wonder where these 6% or where these 14% live. Right. Because I don't know. And, presumably they're out there somewhere. But it tells you something. The media has lost control of the narrative. And that's an amazing thing for the American people, for liberty, and for all of humanity, frankly.
Oh, it's an incredible, it's earthquake proportion, because ultimately, of course, socialism is all about public ownership of the means of communication. And while they may not outright own it formally, there's this informal international establishment control. And their response, as you said, and I know you've done some research on this, is to have censorship through controlling algorithms, removing, people's following. I mean, you've got Google. These are very, very powerful groups. Facebook, Google, Amazon, Twitter. I mean, these are the super rich, most powerful concentrations of wealth in the world right now, actually. I mean, they're up there. And there's actual testimony today at Capitol Hill on this subject. I don't think that the congressmen, and many of them are good people, I don't think they understand technically what's going on with this. You're a bit more savvy on this, Alex. When I got into doing this show, I was very excited over the idea of having it up on YouTube, and then it goes into iHeartRadio and Spotify and all these other incredible directories. But now I've come to understand that I'm up against censorship. I'm up against being knocked down because of algorithm, because of topics that I get into that are controversial. And so it's going to be an extra intense slog for me to break through to any degree. What is going on with this? How are they doing it? And do you think that this could be stopped?
Well, I know there's a lot of people right now working on figuring out how to bypass this, because you're right. I mean, Google is probably one of the most powerful companies in the world. They shape the perceptions of reality for potentially billions of people. I mean, they can destroy your company with the touch of a button just by burying it in the search rankings. You'll never have any customers. And so, right. The power that these companies have amassed is absolutely unfathomable. Many of them got their start with cooperation from the government. Some of these major companies, including Facebook, got some of their early funding directly from the government, right? You have InQtel, which is the kind of investment arm of the U.S. intelligence community that funded a lot of these things. You have DARPA that's been involved in some of these things. You have kind of a rotating, what do they call it? The revolving door between government and high-level positions in, say, Google and Facebook. A lot of them are close to the Hillary campaign. And so the power that they've amassed is just incredibly huge. I think you're right. The people in Congress, even the ones who want to do something about this, they don't really understand what's at stake here or how any of it works. But I think there is now a growing amount of resistance. In fact, just today, an organization that I work with posted an article by a journalist about how they completely severed all their ties with Google. They don't rely on Google for email, not for searches, not for maps, not for anything. And I think that as awareness of this spreads, and awareness is spreading very, very quickly. I mean, even your run-of-the-mill person on the street who is not really attuned to what's going on in the world, they understand that Facebook is trying to control what they see, that Google is trying to knock down conservative content, Christian content, pro-Trump content. You know, your average Trump voter might not understand the intricacies of the deep state or the plan for a new world order, but they like Trump and they understand that the social media companies and Google are being unfair to him. And so this is going to have, I think, dramatic effects in terms of people trying to find alternatives. And there are some good alternatives. I use, for example, DuckDuckGo for all my searches, which is a much better search engine. It doesn't track you. It doesn't try to manipulate your results to conform to some PC ideology. And so I think there's going to be more of that. And my guess is the opposition to this is just getting started. I mean, it's now becoming a hot topic of conversation. And I think, it's hard to know the future, but I think that if the big companies try to continue doing this, they're going to end up with the same problem that CNN has right now, which is the world is going to laugh at them. The president is going to call them fake news, and nobody's going to take them seriously anymore. People will find alternatives, and that'll be the end of that. And once they lose their power, once their monopoly gets smashed, it's not coming back. So they need to be very careful with this line that they're walking.
What is the alternative that you're using instead of Google?
There's a few really good ones. I use one called duckduckgo.com.
Okay.
Startpage.com is another good one, although their search results are enhanced by Google, so I'm not exactly sure what that means, but they vow to secure your privacy. And actually, this article that I posted today by a journalist who was totally enmeshed in everything Google gives very good alternatives to if you want to disassociate yourself from any of the Google services. So, for example, on email, this journalist had been using Gmail for many years. And they switched to a service called Proton Mail based in Switzerland, where they guarantee your privacy. Everything is encrypted. They don't read your email and store it all. So there's all kinds of alternatives like this that are popping up, and I think there's going to be many, many more popping up in the future as people look for alternatives. Excellent.
Alex, we're reaching toward the end. So can you tell me, first of all, where are you right now and what's going on over there?
I am on a little tiny island in the Baltic Sea, and actually tomorrow I'm heading to an even tinier island in the Baltic Sea with no cell phones, no internet, no electricity, just for a camping trip, just for a couple of days. But again, I'm pretty much right smack in the middle of the Baltic Sea between the different Scandinavian countries, Russia, the Baltic.
Åland Islands?
No, but I know which ones you're talking about. They're kind of like semi-autonomous islands
off of coast of Finland.
Beautiful place. I've spent a lot of time there. Actually, that's where a lot of the homeschool refugees from Sweden went after Sweden banned homeschooling. The Finnish education minister welcomed them with open arms. But so I'll be here for another little while, and then we'll be doing some traveling in Scandinavia and then heading down through Eastern Europe. So,
well, let's stay in touch. I want you to check in maybe every other week while you're out there and keep us informed on the ground, so to speak, in Europe, what's happening there. You're kind of the eyes and ears of the place. And Alex Newman, just where can people read your articles and get more information about your work?
Well, thank you so much again for having me on, Chuck. I'd be delighted to join you every other week. And for people who want to read the articles that I'll be producing while over here and all the other stuff, it's at thenewamerican.com. That's our online portal, so that you can bypass the censorship and get the stuff delivered right to your inbox. You can sign up for daily or weekly or monthly headlines in your inbox. And then if you are not a subscriber to the print magazine, I encourage you to get a subscription. You'll get 2 issues every month delivered to your doorstep. Some of the most important news out there, none of the fluff, none of the Kardashians or the fake news, but you'll get what you need to know to help restore our liberties and to keep our republic and our self-government intact.
All right, Alex Newman, listen, I want to thank you for joining me today. Take care. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Chuck.